These night shift nurses think watching ER makes them doctors. That is what Dr. Caldwell said 47 minutes before everything changed. Sarah Chen moves through the ICU's fluorescent glare at 0300 hours, her hand steady despite the tremor in her left thumb that never quite disappeared after Baghdad. The ventilator beside Colonel Morrison's bed wheezed its mechanical rhythm, in, out, a sound she's heard 10,000 times and will hear 10,000 more. She checks the monitors without looking at Caldwell, though she hears him before she sees him. The expensive cologne arrives first, cutting through the antiseptic smell like diesel exhaust cutting through desert air. He strides past her station with a kind of confidence that only comes from never being questioned. 15 residents trail behind him in their pressed white coats, their pens ready, their faces eager. Sarah continues her work. Her movements are economical and precise, the efficiency of someone who doesn't waste energy on unnecessary motion. Check the flow rate. Check the Foley catheter. Check the O2 sat on the monitor, 94%. Stable. Everything exactly as it should be. This is what happens when nursing staff forget their place in the medical hierarchy, Caldwell announces, gesturing toward Morrison's bed as though the man is a teaching exhibit rather than a human being lying unconscious. His voice carries that particular condescension reserved for people he considers below him. Miss Chen here decided to override my explicit treatment protocol without consulting me first. Sarah's jaw doesn't clench. Her breath doesn't catch. Her hands don't pause. She continues adjusting the medication drip with the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. Caldwell continues, emboldened by her silence. Fortunately, Colonel Morrison survived her insubordination despite her intervention, not because of it. Let this be a lesson about staying in your lane. The residents scribble notes. One of them, a young woman with curly hair and nervous eyes, glances at Sarah, then looks away. Sarah has already forgotten the moment. She's looking at Morrison's chest rise and fall, watching the numbers on the monitor, maintaining the composure that has kept her alive through 3 tours and 17 years of operations that officially never happened. Caldwell moves on. The residents follow. The only sound left is the ventilator and the steady beep of the heart monitor. 31 minutes later, Sarah finds herself at the vending machine outside the break room. She doesn't want coffee. The machine glows like a small neon shrine at 3 in the morning, illuminating nothing but her own reflection in the glass. Her scrubs are pressed. Her hair is pulled back. Her face shows nothing. She hears Caldwell's voice before she rounds the corner. These night shift nurses think watching ER makes them doctors, he's saying, his laughter echoing down the hallway like he's told the joke 100 times and finds it funnier each time. He's speaking to someone, the chief of surgery, she realizes. Their voices drift from the physician's lounge, just 20 feet away. Sarah stops. She doesn't move closer. She simply stands there, her hand still in the vending machine's coin slot. I had to shut down one of them today, Caldwell continues. Thought she knew better than me. Thought she could second-guess my treatment protocol in front of the entire resident class. These nurses, they see one medical drama on television and suddenly they're surgeons. The chief of surgery's response is muffled, inaudible. That's the problem, Caldwell says. No respect for hierarchy. No understanding of the chain of command. They think a stethoscope makes them physicians. The worst part? HR won't let me do anything about it because she's decorated. 20 years of perfect evaluations. Impossible to fire without cause. Sarah's hands remain perfectly steady as she inserts coins for coffee she doesn't want. The machine hums. A plastic cup drops. Liquid fills it. The hiss of steam escapes, and she retrieves the cup. Her movements are mechanical. A ghost going through the motions. I'll handle it, Caldwell says, his voice taking on a harder edge. If she questions my orders again, I'm calling security myself. No nurse in my hospital is going to undermine me. Not on my watch. Sarah returns to her station without a word. The coffee sits untouched on the counter beside her charting. Her mask never slips. Her composure is a fortress, and Caldwell is still outside trying to find the gate. 2 hours later, as dawn approaches and the night shift reaches that strange hollow point where exhaustion becomes almost spiritual, Caldwell appears at her station. His expression is pleasant. Dangerous. "Miss Chen," he says. A word. Sarah looks up from her charting. She doesn't stand. "Of course, Doctor. I want to be clear about something." He leans against the counter with the ease of someone accustomed to being listened to. "Colonel Morrison is my patient. My responsibility. My protocol. If there is ever a situation, ever, where you feel the need to question my treatment decisions, you do so in private. You do so respectfully. You do so with the understanding that I am the physician and you are the nurse. Are we clear?" "Yes, Doctor," Sarah says. Her voice is quiet. Deferential. The voice of someone who understands the game and plays it well. "And if you deviate from my orders again," he continues, "if you so much as suggest an alternative treatment without my express permission, I will have security escort you from this building personally. Do you understand?" "I understand, Doctor." He nods, satisfied. He's won. He doesn't know he's already lost. Sarah returns to her work. Her hands check the monitors. Her eyes track the numbers. Her mind is somewhere else entirely, somewhere in the past, in a place where the rules were different and the cost of following orders was measured in lives. She finishes her shift at 0700 and walks to her locker in the basement. The fluorescent lights flicker overhead, casting everything in that green-white glow that makes the world feel unreal. Her locker is small and neat. 2 sets of spare scrubs. A change of clothes for emergencies. A thermos she's owned for 12 years. And at the bottom, wrapped in a plastic grocery bag, a pair of worn combat boots. She pulls out the bag and sits on the bench in front of the locker. The boots are leather, cracked with age, the lace is brittle and grey. The soles are worn thin in places. The heel of the left boot is scuffed where a bullet grazed it 20 years ago in Baghdad, in a place called Sadr City, in a building that doesn't exist on any map anymore. 20 years ago, she was someone else. Someone with a rank and a call sign and a family she doesn't talk about. Someone who ran into burning buildings and pulled children from rubble. Someone who held a dying woman's hand while the woman whispered a promise in Arabic, a promise that her son would live, that someone would protect him, that he would grow up to be more than another statistic in a war that had already swallowed everything else. Sarah touches the boots the way someone might touch a scar. Not with pain, but with recognition. With the simple acknowledgement that this happened. That it was real. That some promises don't expire just because you change your name and your life and your entire identity. The tremor in her left thumb intensifies slightly as she traces the worn leather. It's the only part of her that remembers. The rest of her has learned to move forward, to push for lines and monitor vitals and say yes, doctor to men like Caldwell while her hands do the work of keeping people alive. She wraps the boots back in the plastic bag. Places them carefully at the bottom of the locker. Closes the door. When she walks out into the Houston morning, the rain is just starting, soft and warm, the kind of rain that smells like wet asphalt and diesel exhaust. She stands in it for a moment, letting it fall on her hair and her scrubs and her steady, trembling hands. The city is waking up around her. Traffic begins its daily roar. Somewhere far above, the sky is clearing toward blue. She has nowhere to be. No one to answer to. No identity to return to. But in room for 12 of Seattle General Hospital, a man named Colonel Morrison is alive because of a promise made 2 decades ago to a woman who didn't survive to see it kept. And Sarah Chen, whoever she is, whatever name the military erased when they buried that mission, will make sure that promise holds. The quiet ones are always the most dangerous. They're the ones with nothing left to lose. The grand rounds began at 0800, exactly as they always did. 15 residents in pristine white coats gathered around the nursing station while Dr. Caldwell reviewed his cases for the morning, his voice carrying the tone of someone accustomed to absolute deference. Sarah was adjusting Colonel Morrison's for drip when she heard her name spoken aloud, not as a question, not as acknowledgement, but as a cautionary lesson. "Come," Caldwell announced, gesturing to the assembled residents like a conductor positioning musicians. "I want you to see this." They filed past Morrison's bed in a line, rubber-soled shoes squeaking against the polished tile floor, their notebooks already open. Sarah kept her eyes on the vitals monitor. Steady. Stable. Morrison's oxygen saturation holding at 96%, heart rate a consistent 82. The facts were written in numbers that didn't lie. Caldwell positioned himself at the foot of the bed, his posture straight, his expression conveying a mixture of disappointment and theatrical disdain. "This is what happens when nursing staff forget their place in the medical hierarchy," he began, his voice pitched for the entire group to hear. "Miss Chen here decided to override my explicit treatment protocol for Colonel Morrison without consulting me first." Sarah's jaw tightened imperceptibly. Her hand remained steady as she adjusted the flow rate, her movements precise and unhurried. She did not look at Caldwell. She did not look at the residents. Her attention stayed fixed on her work, on Morrison's monitors, on the 103 small responsibilities that constituted a night shift nurse's actual job. "Nurses," Caldwell continued, and now his voice had taken on the quality of a man delivering a sermon, "are the cornerstone of hospital operations. No one disputes that. But they are not physicians. They do not possess medical degrees. They do not have the years of training required to make clinical decisions." He paused, letting the weight of that statement settle over the room like humidity before a storm. When a nurse, even one with good intentions, decides that she knows better than her supervising physician, what we have is chaos. What we have is patient endangerment. The resident scribbled furiously. Sarah could hear the scratch of pen on paper, the whisper of pages turning, the small sounds of young physicians absorbing doctrine like scripture. One resident, a woman with dark hair and nervous eyes, actually looked at Sarah, confusion flickering across her face. Sarah didn't return the look. "Miss Chen's associate degree," Caldwell said, and now there was an edge to his voice, a knife wrapped in civility, "does not compare to my 15 years of critical care experience. My fellowship training. My research publications." Yet she felt empowered to second-guess my judgment regarding this patient's care plan. He gestured at Morrison, who remained unconscious, his chest rising and falling in the steady rhythm of the ventilator. "Consider yourselves warned. This is the kind of boundary violation that results in lawsuits. Patient harm. Career-ending investigations." Sarah's fingers didn't waver as she checked the medication pump, verifying the infusion rate against the printed order. 20 milliliters per hour. Correct. She documented the time on Morrison's chart, 0813, in her neat, precise handwriting. The act of recording data became her shield, her justification for not looking up, not responding, not giving Caldwell the reaction he was clearly fishing for. A resident with wire-rimmed glasses raised his hand slightly. "Doctor, what was the specific protocol violation?" Caldwell's smile was thin and satisfied, the smile of a man who had just been asked the perfect question. Miss Chen believed that her bedside assessment trumped established medical protocol. She thought her observations were worth overriding explicit physician orders. "I'm sure you all recognize the danger in that kind of thinking." Sarah closed the medication chart and moved to check Morrison's catheter bag, noting the output volume and color in her shift notes. The documentation was meticulous. Every action had a reason. Every decision could be justified. This was how you survived in a system designed to make you invisible. The residents followed Caldwell as he moved to the next bed, their white coats billowing slightly in the air-conditioned breeze, and Sarah's shoulders released a tension she hadn't consciously registered. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead with their constant electric hum, the sound like insects trapped in glass. By the time she finished her morning rounds, word had already spread through the hospital with the speed of a contagion. She could feel it in the way the resident physicians addressed her, more formal, more distant, as if proximity to her might contaminate their own judgment. The attending cardiologist actually pulled her aside near the medication room and lowered his voice. "I heard what happened in grand rounds. For what it's worth, I think Caldwell's full of it. Sarah appreciated the sentiment but didn't respond to it. Allyship was a luxury she couldn't afford. Gratitude was a liability. For hours later, she was walking to the break room with a cup of water and a granola bar she wasn't hungry for when she heard voices, familiar voices, coming from the hallway junction near the stairwell. Caldwell's voice had that particular cadence that meant he was performing for an audience. The chief of surgery, judging by the deeper register, responding occasionally. "I've got a nurse playing doctor with a Delta Force colonel," Caldwell said, and his laugh was like glass breaking. "Can you imagine the liability? The kid thinks she's some kind of hero because she noticed a few vital sign changes. I had to put her in her place in front of the entire medical team. She needs to understand the hierarchy." Sarah moved past the junction without breaking stride, her water cup steady, her breathing measured. Her heart rate didn't elevate. Her palms didn't sweat. The training that had kept her alive in a collapsed building in Baghdad 2 decades ago kept her calm now, the ability to absorb information without reaction, to process threat assessment without displaying fear. She disappeared into the break room before either man could see her, before they could know she'd heard, before anything in her expression could betray what she'd learned. The chief of surgery had laughed politely and said something about documentation and the importance of physician authority. Then his footsteps had moved away, down the hallway, toward the elevators. That afternoon, during the shift change briefing, Caldwell appeared at the nursing station where Sarah was completing her medication reconciliation. 3 other nurses were present, Jessica from orthopedics, Marcus from the ICU, and Patricia who floated between units. They all suddenly became very focused on their own paperwork. "Miss Chen," Caldwell said quietly, which was somehow worse than if he'd raised his voice. "A word." Sarah set down her pen and stood, turning to face him with her expression neutral. Her 5'10" frame straightened to full height, shoulders back, the posture of someone who had once stood at attention for hours in desert heat. Caldwell was taller by 2 inches, but his height seemed to diminish in the face of her absolute stillness. "If you question my orders again," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear, "I will have security escort you from this building. I will file a complaint with the State Nursing Board. I will contact the hospital's legal department." He paused, letting each threat settle like sediment. "Are you following me, Miss Chen? Or do I need to use smaller words?" Sarah's jaw tightened at the insult, but her voice when she spoke was steady and quiet, pitched so only he would hear it. "Perfectly clear, Doctor." "Good," he said, and there was satisfaction in his voice, the satisfaction of a man who had just confirmed his own authority. "Then we understand each other." He walked away without waiting for response, and Sarah returned to her medication reconciliation. Her hands didn't shake as she filled out the documentation. But her knuckles were white around the pen, and the paper beneath the ballpoint was nearly perforated from the pressure of her grip. Jessica leaned over and whispered, "He's such a..." "Don't," Sarah said quietly. Not unkindly, just final. She couldn't afford for Jessica's sympathy to become her own narrative. Every word spoken in solidarity could be twisted into evidence of resentment, of bias, of motivation for the insubordination Caldwell was building a case around. She worked through the rest of her shift mechanically, performing the 1,000 small tasks that constituted competent nursing care. Medications on time. Vital signs documented. Patient comfort addressed. By 19:30 hours, her patients were settled, their evening medications administered, their rooms darkened for sleep. Morrison remained stable, his monitors showing the steady rhythm of a man healing slowly in pharmaceutical slumber, unaware of the current swirling around his bed. But something was different when Sarah made her 2,100 rounds. She noticed it immediately, a slight change in the chest tube drainage. The collection chamber that had been nearly empty at 1,900 now contained approximately 100 milliliters of fluid. Blood-tinged. More than expected for a patient 2 days post-surgery. Sarah checked the time, 2,102 hours. She documented the amount, the color, the consistency. 100 cc of fluid drainage in 2 hours was within normal range, but her instincts, the instincts that had kept her and an 8-year-old boy alive in a collapsed basement while explosions rattled the foundation above them, those instincts were already alerting her to something wrong. Not yet critical. Not yet life-threatening. But wrong. She marked it in the chart and moved to the next patient, but her attention kept drifting back to Morrison's monitors. His blood pressure was 98/60, still acceptable, but lower than his baseline of 120/70. When she checked again at 2,200, the drainage had increased to 200 milliliters. The drainage at 2,300 hours was 300 milliliters. Sarah stood at Morrison's bedside, checking the chest tube one more time before the shift change, and her jaw tightened. The blood was coming faster now. Not in a steady drip, but in dark red pulses that pooled in the collection chamber like a countdown she couldn't stop. She made a note, 300 hours, 400 cubic centimeters in 10 minutes, and her eyes moved to the monitor. His systolic pressure had dropped from 98 to 72. Then 70. His oxygen saturation was 78% and falling. She didn't call for Caldwell. She didn't page anyone. She simply stood there, her hand resting on Morrison's wrist, feeling the flutter of his pulse, too fast, too weak, the rhythm of a heart that was drowning in its own blood. The pericardial sac was filling. She was certain of it. His heart was being crushed from the inside out, and nobody in this hospital except her understood what was happening because nobody in this hospital except her had pulled a suffocating boy from Baghdad rubble 20 years ago and promised a dying mother she would keep him alive. The boy's eyes had been open. That was the detail that never left her, even now. Even with his chest covered in dust and his leg pinned under concrete, he'd opened his eyes and looked at her like she was the only real thing in a city that had just exploded. His mother had been beside him, her hand still holding his, already cooling. "Promise me," the woman had whispered in Arabic, and Sarah, then a 22-year-old combat medic running on adrenaline and rage, had nodded and said the words in broken Arabic she'd learned from her squad. "I promise. He will live. I promise." Now he was lying in a hospital bed in Seattle General, wearing a colonel's bars and a chest tube, and the same darkness that had come for him in Baghdad was here in the ICU, moving fast, and Caldwell was in the hallway speaking to someone on his phone. "The cardiothoracic surgeon is completing a procedure," Caldwell was saying, his voice smooth and untroubled. "He'll be available in approximately 45 minutes. Morrison can tolerate that timeline. We'll increase the 4 fluids and monitor closely. 45 minutes. Sarah did the math in her head the way she'd been trained to do it, not with hope, but with the cold precision of triage. At this rate of blood loss, Morrison's systolic pressure would bottom out in 4 minutes. 8 at the absolute most. The pressure drops, the perfusion collapses, the organs shut down. Brain death follows shortly after. After that, nothing matters anymore. She moved to the ultrasound machine. Not quickly. Not panicked. Just a night shift nurse preparing for a procedure, the same way she'd prepared for dozens of procedures in forward operating bases and field hospitals across 4 continents that officially never existed in any record, anywhere. Her hands were already steady. They always were. Caldwell appeared in the doorway. He saw the ultrasound probe in her hand, saw her drawing up lidocaine, so the pericardiocentesis needle kit she'd already opened on the sterile field next to Morrison's bed. His face went pale, then red. "Chen. What are you doing?" "My job," she said, her voice level as glass. She was prepping Morrison's chest, swabbing the area beneath the xiphoid process with chlorhexidine, creating the sterile field. Her movements were economical, precise, muscle memory shaped by hundreds of field procedures, thousands of hours spent keeping soldiers alive in places where the surgeons were 8 hours away. "Step away from that patient right now." Caldwell's voice had changed. It was no longer the smooth, condescending tone he used on residents. This was the voice of a man watching his control collapse. "I'm ordering you to step back, Chen. Now." She didn't respond. She was positioning the ultrasound probe, watching the image appear on the screen, the pericardial sac dark with blood, Morrison's heart compressed and struggling like a fist closing around a bird. She adjusted the needle, angling it 30 degrees from vertical, and the ultrasound image tracked her hand as she advanced. "I'm calling security," Caldwell said, and she heard him dialing. His voice was shaking now. Fury and fear mixed together, the sound of a man who was accustomed to absolute obedience suddenly confronted with someone who wasn't listening. "Get ICU immediately. I need a security team to the cardiac unit. Now." The needle advanced. Sarah felt the subtle pop as it breached the pericardial sac, a sensation like puncturing a water balloon from the inside, a release of pressure that only she would recognize. The syringe came back dark. Blood. 60 milliliters of blood that had been suffocating Morrison's heart, and with each milliliter withdrawn, the pressure inside his chest decreased and his heart could expand again and his blood could pump again. "You're finished here, Chen," Caldwell was saying into the phone, his voice high and thin. "She's performing unauthorized procedures. Call Chief of Staff. Tell him we have a rogue nurse practicing medicine without a license in ICU." Sarah withdrew another 15 milliliters. The ultrasound image showed the pericardial sac already smaller, Morrison's heart already more mobile. She could see his ejection fraction improving in real time, could see the chambers filling and contracting with better geometry, better force. 45 more milliliters came out, dark and slow, each one a reprieve. The monitor changed. His oxygen saturation climbed from 78 to 82 to 88. His systolic pressure rose from 70 to 90 to 110. By the time the last drop of blood left the needle, his vital signs had stabilized into something sustainable, something human, the kind of numbers that didn't look like dying anymore. She withdrew the needle cleanly, applied pressure to the site with a sterile gauze, and stepped back from the bed. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was steady. The only thing that wasn't steady was Caldwell's voice, which had cracked into something almost panicked as he spoke urgently to someone on the other end of the line. Security was on its way. Chief of Staff was being contacted. The State Board was about to be notified. His words came out rapid fire, stumbling over themselves, the vocabulary of a man desperately building a case against someone he'd just watched save a life in violation of every protocol he'd ever written. Sarah looked at Morrison's face. His color was better. His breathing was easier. The trembling, which wasn't fear but restraint, the kind of restraint that came from knowing exactly how much damage you could do and choosing not to do it, that trembling was over now. The door burst open and 2 security officers appeared, their hands already resting on their belts, their faces confused because they'd been told to remove a rogue nurse, but they could see the monitor, could see the numbers climbing, could see a man sleeping more peacefully than he'd slept in hours. They stood there for a moment, uncertain, waiting for Caldwell to give them the order that he'd promised was coming. But what they didn't know was that Colonel Marcus Morrison, that 8-year-old boy who'd opened his eyes in the rubble of Baghdad, had been awake for the last 40 seconds. He'd been watching Sarah work with the kind of clarity that comes from being able to breathe again, from having a heart that wasn't being crushed by its own blood. And his eyes, when they found hers, held the kind of recognition that couldn't be faked or doubted or explained away by anyone in a white coat. The room went quiet. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like they were about to say something but thought better of it. Caldwell's phone hung at his side, and Sarah could hear the tiny voice still talking on the other end, asking what was happening, asking for clarification, asking why a doctor wasn't answering. Sarah turned toward the security officers with her badge already in her hand. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice so soft they almost couldn't hear her. "I think Dr. Caldwell is ready to speak with you about his concerns." The security officers looked at each other. They'd been told to remove her. They'd been told there was an emergency, a violation, a rogue element in the ICU. But what they were seeing was a patient with normal vital signs and a doctor whose hands were shaking while a nurse's hands had been steady as stone. That wasn't the worst part, though. The worst part was still 5 hours away, waiting in the form of federal agents and classified files and 4-star generals who would soon be learning that Dr. Caldwell had attempted to manipulate the medical record of a patient under federal protection. But Sarah didn't know that yet. She was only thinking about one thing the promise had held. 20 years. 2 continents. One hospital in Seattle where everything she'd been forced to become, the combat medic, the weapons-grade operative, the ghost that had been legally erased, that had all been necessary to keep a promise made over a dying woman's hand in Baghdad. Blood pressure 78/45. Dropping. Sarah's eyes locked on the monitor as Morrison's systolic numbers slid downward like a slow-motion car crash she couldn't stop. 72. 68. The chest tube drainage that had stabilized 20 minutes ago was accelerating again, dark red blood filling the collection chamber at a rate that meant his pericardial sac was refilling, squeezing his heart like a fist closing around a bird's throat. 65. She moved to his bedside without thinking, her hands already reaching for the ultrasound machine before her conscious mind caught up to what her body already knew. Step away from that patient, Chen, or I'm calling security right now. Caldwell's voice cut through the ICU like a blade, but Sarah's focus was absolute. The ultrasound probe was in her hand, the transducer gel spreading across Morrison's chest wall in practice strokes. There, the pericardial effusion. Blood pooling around his heart, darkening with each passing second as his cardiac output collapsed. She'd pulled this boy from rubble in Baghdad 20 years ago. An 8-year-old wrapped in dust and screaming, his mother already bleeding out from a collapsed building, her hand gripping Sarah's wrist with the last strength she possessed. "Promise me," the woman had whispered in broken English. "Promise my son lives." Sarah had held that boy's small face against her body armor for 3 days while Iraqi insurgents swept the grid squares. 3 days in a hole. 3 days of his heart beating against her chest. And now that same heart was suffocating. The phone slipped from Caldwell's hand as he watched her draw up the lidocaine, watched her prep the xiphoid space with the precision of someone who'd performed this procedure in conditions he couldn't imagine. Not in an operating room. In the dark. Under fire. With nothing but a field kit and the absolute certainty that hesitation meant death. "I'm calling security. Right now. This is insubordination." Her hands moved before his words finished landing. The needle went in. 14-gauge angiocath, inserted beneath the xiphoid process at a 45-degree angle. The landmark-based technique taught to combat medics because ultrasound wasn't always an option when mortars were falling. She advanced the needle slowly, listening for the give, feeling for the moment when the needle tip pierced the pericardial sac. The hiss of air escaping. Blood following immediately into the syringe like a burgundy tide. "Security!" Now, Caldwell barked into his phone, his face darkening as he watched Morrison's blood drain into a 20-milliliter syringe that Sarah withdrew with absolute calm. 30 cc, 40 cc, 60 cc blood that had been crushing Morrison's heart with each systole, with each desperate contraction of a muscle that was suffocating under its own fluid. She withdrew the needle. Placed a gauze dressing over the puncture site with tape applied with the geometric precision of someone who'd dressed wounds in sandstorm conditions where infection meant amputation. Morrison's blood pressure rose like a dawn breaking. 78. 85. 92. 110/70. The monitor's rhythm stabilized into the steady beep of a heart freed from compression, beating now with the full force it was meant to generate. A man living instead of dying. A promise kept. But Caldwell wasn't dialing cardiothoracic. Wasn't calling the chief of staff to celebrate. His phone was already pressed to his ear, and his voice had shifted into something different, something methodical and measured. "Yes. St. Jude's board. I need to reach Dr. Pierce immediately. Tell him it's urgent." A pause. His eyes never left Sarah's face. "Yes, I'll hold." She removed her gloves without ceremony. The ICU nurses were staring at her with expression somewhere between awe and terror. Someone should have been celebrating. Someone should have documented the save, the impossible intervention that had restarted a man's dying heart with nothing but a needle and steady hands. Instead, the room had fractured into something else. "Dr. Pierce?" "Yes, it's Caldwell. We have a situation here at Seattle General that requires immediate board attention." His voice was calm. Professional. Almost pleasant. A nurse on my service performed an unauthorized procedure this morning. Emergency pericardiocentesis. On my explicit orders not to touch the patient. A smile was spreading across his face as he spoke, and that was the moment Sarah understood. He wasn't panicked. He wasn't desperate. He was building something. Yes. I have witnesses. The entire night shift. She violated direct physician orders. Clear grounds for termination, and I'm recommending we go for license suspension as well. Caldwell was nodding, his free hand gesturing as if Pierce could see him through the phone. No, the patient survived. That's actually the problem, isn't it? Makes this more complicated legally. We'll need documentation that she acted entirely without authorization. I'm thinking we cite patient endangerment despite the outcome. Precedent. The phone call continued as Sarah walked out of Morrison's room. She didn't see the security guard standing in the hallway until they moved toward her. One was older, army tattoo visible on his neck, the bearing of someone who'd worn a uniform and understood what one looked like. He didn't want to be doing this. But he was already gesturing for her to follow him. I need you to come with us, Ms. Chen. She removed her badge without being asked. The plastic lanyard hung in her hand for a moment before she set it on the nearest supply cart. No one moved to retrieve it. The nurses along the hallway had suddenly found reasons to look at their phones, at their medication cards, at anything except her face. The walk to the parking garage happened in absolute silence. Boots on tile. 1, 2, 3, 4. The younger guard kept pace on her left, the older one on her right. They didn't touch her. Didn't need to. She was following protocol, complying, not resisting, her posture straight and her eyes forward. Just a nurse. Just someone who'd forgotten her place. The email arrived at 11:53 a.m. Sarah sat in her 15-year-old Honda in the parking garage, the keys in her hand but unused. The engine was off. The silence was complete except for the distant hum of fluorescent lights above and the occasional sound of a car door slamming in some other section of the garage, in some other life. Her phone buzzed. Another email from HR requesting immediate return of all hospital property. Then another. Then a call from a number with a 206 area code, external investigators. She didn't answer. What would she say? That she'd saved a man's life by breaking every protocol that kept her safe. That she had no identity to prove, no records to show, no credentials that were actually real because Master Chief Petty Officer Sarah Chen was supposed to be dead? The boots were in her trunk. Worn combat boots with laces that still had sand from Baghdad embedded in the weave. The only proof she'd ever existed before Seattle General. Before the erased years. Before she'd been ordered to disappear and she'd actually done it. She pressed her forehead against the steering wheel. No identity to return to. No records. No proof. Nothing but a pair of boots and a promise she'd somehow kept anyway, and now that same promise had cost her everything. The parking garage stretched around her in concrete silence, and for the first time in 36 hours, her hands began to tremble. But that wasn't the worst part. That was the moment the rotors started. The Black Hawks landed on Seattle General's helipad at 1,400 hours, rotors still spinning like the sound of war itself coming home. For Delta Force operators in full combat kit, body armor, rifle muzzles down, faces hard as granite, strode through the ICU corridor demanding to speak with Phantom. The name stopped everyone cold. A veteran security guard whose grandfather had served in Vietnam felt his knees weaken. His face went white. Suddenly, he stood at rigid attention and announced, "Master Chief Petty Officer on deck," his voice cracking like thin ice. Dr. Caldwell froze mid-stride. His coffee cup hung suspended in his right hand, steam rising like a question mark he couldn't answer. A two-star general, insignia sharp as a knife wound on his Class A uniform, walked past Caldwell without acknowledging his existence. The doctor might as well have been furniture. The general's boots clicked against the tile with military precision, each step a judgment, and he moved directly to the ICU nurse's station where Sarah stood updating Morrison's chart. The room around them seemed to contract. 23 medical staff members watched this man with 2 stars on his shoulder open a classified folder that made the chief of staff's face drain of all color. The general's voice carried the weight of 20 years of command. He read Sarah's record aloud, each word hitting like a precision strike. Silver star. Pause. Reaction rippled through the room, whispers, stares, Dr. Caldwell's coffee cup lowering to the counter with a rattle. Silver star. The second one. A resident's pen dropped. Bronze star with Valor. The attending physician stepped backward involuntarily, as if the words had physical force. Bronze star with Valor. The general's eyes remained fixed on the medical staff assembled before him, watching their faces reorganize their understanding of the quiet night shift nurse they'd dismissed. 17 years of operations across 4 continents. The general paused. Officially, none of it happened. The silence tasted like copper and regret. Medical separation, the general continued, his voice precise as surgical steel. Listed as medical discharge due to injury sustained in combat operations. He turned the folder slightly, the classified stamp visible to everyone. In reality, reassignment to deep cover civilian capacity. Subject's face became too recognizable in certain geographic areas. Too many people in too many countries would have recognized her. So she disappeared. New identity. New life. New name in the system. The general looked directly at Dr. Caldwell for the first time. His gaze held the temperature of a frozen tarmac at 0600 hours. Then he turned away, leaving the doctor standing alone with his coffee and his catastrophic miscalculation. Colonel Morrison's eyes opened. Consciousness returning, vision clearing, the sedation wearing off like fog retreating from a coastline. He saw Sarah first. Then he saw the general. Then he saw Dr. Caldwell standing near the foot of his bed, and Morrison's body stiffened with an understanding that came from bone-deep military knowledge. He tried to sit up. A nurse stabilized him gently. His voice, when it came, was quiet but carried the authority of Delta Force rank and something far more powerful, the weight of truth spoken by someone who had nothing left to lose. That woman, Morrison said, each word deliberate and measured, his eyes locked on Caldwell's face, carried me 6 miles through enemy fire after my entire family was killed in the initial strike. His jaw clenched. 6 miles. Through streets where insurgents had set up checkpoints every 2 blocks. The heart monitor beeped its steady rhythm, Sarah's second gift to him still beating. She stayed with me 3 days in a hole beneath a collapsed building while they hunted us. 3 days. No water. No medical supplies. Just her promise. Dr. Caldwell's face had gone the color of institutional walls. She promised my mother with her dying breath that I would live, Morrison continued, his voice cracking slightly, the only break in his military composure. That I would get out. That I would survive. She kept that promise. He looked directly at Sarah, and something in his expression shifted from military precision to something more profound, gratitude that had traveled 20 years through blood and violence and impossible odds. She's the reason I'm Delta Force instead of a corpse in Baghdad. Morrison's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. She's the reason I'm alive. The room went dead silent. Nobody moved. The only sound was the monitor's steady beep, 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 the percussion of Sarah's intervention, the rhythm of a heart she had restarted with hands steady enough to make surgeons weep. 10 seconds passed. Then 15. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song. Someone's pager buzzed and nobody answered it. A nurse in the corner had tears running down her cheeks and didn't bother wiping them away. The FBI arrived that evening at 18:30 hours. 2 agents in dark suits carrying credentials that made hospital administration's faces rearrange. They had discovered something during their preliminary review of Seattle General's personnel files. Something that had triggered a federal response faster than emergency transport. Dr. Caldwell's termination paperwork, filed at 0600 hours, contained claims that Sarah Chen had no verifiable employment history prior to 2004. No military service records in any official database. Falsified references. Claims he had absolutely no way to verify in the 6 hours since the incident. But he had tried. Security footage showed Caldwell at an HR terminal at 0615 hours, before official business hours, before anyone else had arrived for the day shift, accessing personnel files he had no authorization to view. Attempting to alter them. Attempting to make Sarah's existence disappear the way she had disappeared from public record 20 years ago. Attempting to do electronically what the military had done operationally, erase her. The agent's questions came like surgical strikes. To the Chief of Staff, did Dr. Caldwell call you at 0630 hours requesting special handling of Ms. Chen's termination? Answer, yes. To the hospital board member who was Caldwell's medical school roommate, are you aware that accessing classified personnel records without authorization is a federal felony? Silence. To the IT department, whose credentials did Dr. Caldwell use to access the restricted files? Answer, a temporary admin account that was deactivated at 0500 hours. Somehow he still had access. Unauthorized access to classified personnel records belonging to a protected service member. Falsifying federal documents. Obstruction of justice. Attempting to interfere with the official status of a military operative. By day 3, Dr. Caldwell was suspended from all clinical duties pending investigation. By day 7, federal agents arrived at his home at 0630 hours, the same time he had made his crucial phone call, walked him out of his house in handcuffs while his neighbors watched from their windows, their expressions shifting from confusion to understanding to satisfaction. The charges were read aloud on his front lawn like a public indictment delivered by the universe itself. 2 years later, someone spotted Dr. Caldwell in Houston, Texas, teaching CPR fundamentals at a community college near the medical center where his career had imploded. He earned $18 per hour. His medical license was permanently revoked across all 50 states. His malpractice insurance had been cancelled. His savings had been depleted by legal fees that exceeded $700,000. His marriage had ended. His reputation had evaporated like morning mist. He taught certification classes to high school students who'd never heard of Seattle General Hospital, standing before teenagers in gym clothes, demonstrating chest compressions on a plastic mannequin, trying not to think about the hands that had been steadier than his hands had ever been. The helipad at Seattle General glowed orange in the sunset light. Sarah Chen stood there alone at first, then Morrison appeared beside her, both of them silhouetted against the Cascade Mountains in the distance. She wore her dress uniform, dress blues with ribbons precisely placed, insignia sharp as broken glass. And on her feet, lace tight for the first time in 2 decades, were those worn combat boots. The leather was creased exactly where it had been creased in Baghdad. The laces were frayed at the edges. The soles bore the dust of streets she had walked 20 years ago carrying a boy through enemy fire. Colonel Morrison stood in his Class A uniform, every medal and ribbon properly aligned, his hair military short, his posture the architecture of a man who had survived because another person had kept a promise. He rendered a textbook salute, the motion clean and precise, his hand rising to his brow with the respect of a warrior saluting the warrior who had saved his life not once but twice, separated by 2 decades and impossible circumstances. Sarah's hand rose to return the salute. Her fingers touched her brow. Her voice, when she spoke, carried the weight of an identity finally reclaimed. "Thank you, Colonel." "Master Chief," Morrison said quietly, a statement not a request, using her rank the way it should have been used all along. "Thank you." The helicopter rotors began to spin. The sound built from a whisper to a roar, with a roar of vindication, of truth emerging from classified shadows, of quiet strength finally acknowledged. Sarah walked toward the aircraft with Morrison beside her, their shadows stretching across the helipad like the bridge between 2 eras of the same life. She allowed herself the smallest smile as she boarded, not the professional smile of a nurse, but the genuine expression of someone who had finally come home. The quietest person in the room might be holding it all together. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value, you need to hear Sarah's full story. Subscribe to the channel now. Like this video if you believe that character and integrity matter more than titles or uniforms. And in the comments, tell us, what would you have done if you were standing in Dr. Caldwell's shoes when the Black Hawks landed? What would you have done when the truth walked through those doors in combat boots?